Hello there and welcome back to the Code Wrinkles channel for a brand new Blazor video. And if you want to know how to use repositories in Blazor Server apps the right way, this is exactly the right video for you, because this is what we're gonna talk about. And before we get started, I just want to mention that we recently created another video which is called Using EF Core in Blazor Server Apps the Right Way. And if you didn't watch that video, then it might be a good idea to watch it before you watch this video or before you continue watching, because what we do today or in this video, we'll actually build upon what we have done already in that other video, including the application that we'll use is exactly the same. We're basically gonna start at the exact same point where we actually left off during the last video. And in that video, we covered a lot of very important topics on why Blazor Server is actually a totally different programming pattern and what are the challenges of using a DB context in Blazor Server apps. And of course, we also showed how we can overcome those challenges and how we use the DB context in Blazor Server apps the right way. So in this video, we're gonna actually go one step further, of course. And if you want to implement repository pattern, then this is exactly what we will continue to do today. But before we can get started, I just want to emphasize really a few very important points. There are a lot of discussions out there about whether you should use a repository pattern with Entity Framework Core or you shouldn't use repository pattern with EF Core, and there are a lot of opinions for both sides. And in my opinion, those discussions are a little bit opinionated, and what we aim in this video is not actually contributing to that at all, but assuming that you actually want to use a repository pattern in your Blazor Server app because maybe it is required or things like that, then we just want to show you how to do that the right way. The other point that I would like to emphasize before really getting going with this video is that we actually don't implement here right now a best practice on how to implement a repository. For that we have another video, and I will leave you the links to both of the videos in the description of this video, so you might want to check them first. But we already have a video about using the repository pattern in ASP.NET Core apps. So what we're gonna do today is actually have a bare minimum of weather forecast repository that we can use in order to implement or to change, to update actually our update forecast component in order to use that repository instead of directly the DB context. So that's all. We won't use interfaces and things like that. We're gonna really keep it very, very simple. So let's get started with it. So here, what we have actually, just give me 1 second that I will change the screens here. Only a few seconds, that would be it. So what we have here is actually the update forecast component that we have created in the other video. So right now what we actually want to do is, as we can see here, we use the context factory, and we explained in the previous video why we use this context factory. And we actually use directly the DB context that we create here in each method actually to perform the actions that we want to perform, of course. And what our aim for today is, we will actually want to replace this DB context with using our repository that we want to use. But in order to do that, of course, we need a repository. So let's go here in this data folder and let's create here a new class. And we'll call this class weather forecast repository. And I hope I typed it correctly, and that should be it. And if you implement a repository pattern in Blazor Server apps, then there is one important thing that you need to do, and probably you are not accustomed to do it if you developed regular ASP.NET Core applications so far. And this is actually implementing the IDisposable interface. And a lot of you will say, yeah, but this is a best practice. And I fully agree with you, this is a best practice. However, as we are accustomed in ASP.NET Core applications where we add our repositories as scope services, we actually don't have to take care about disposing the context and things like that, because the context gets disposed actually when each HTTP response is generated and leaves the server, and that's it. So we don't really have to take care about that. So this is why in regular ASP.NET Core applications, we actually are not really accustomed to really use this IDisposable or to implement this IDisposable interface, although as said, I fully agree that it is a best practice. However, when we develop Blazor Server apps, implementing this IDisposable interface is totally necessary, and we will see exactly why just in a few minutes when we'll go and implement the repository in the update weather forecast component. So let's get actually started with this repository. So what we would need here is not a const, but a CTOR, a constructor. And of course, as we do with repositories, we will inject here what is called this weather DB context. So this is what we will inject here. And let's call this context. And of course, we will also need a private field for that, private read-only weather DB context, let's call it like that. And in the constructor, we will just assign this to our field like this. So this is really nothing special. If you have written repositories so far, this is a pretty standard way of doing things. Now, what we will do here is actually, first of all, we can right now implement this IDisposable interface. And actually, the only thing that we need to do here in this IDisposable interface is actually to dispose the DB context. So that's actually what we want to do here. And further, we will just implement two methods here in this repository. The first one is public async. It will be a task of weather forecast, because we will return a weather forecast and get forecast by ID. That would be how our method is called. And here we'll have an int that would represent the ID of a certain weather forecast. Now, what we're going to do here in this method, well, of course, we'll just return wait, and here we use context forecast first or default async. And of course, we want to look after the weather forecast that has the ID that we actually received here as an incoming parameter. So we look for a forecast for which the ID is equal to ID, and that should be it. And we will return it. First of default async, sorry for that. We want to use everything asynchronously, and that should actually do it. Of course, we need to add Microsoft Entity Framework Core, and now we should be good to go. Now, the second method that we will have is public async. We will just return a task here, and we'll call this update forecast. And what we will need here is just to get a weather forecast with the updated context. So weather forecast. And what we will do here is simply a context forecasts update. And here we will just say, okay, please update me this forecast very please. And then of course we have to save the changes, because only then the changes are really saved to the database. And of course we need to await this. We are in an async method, and that's actually it. This is a very basic repository, but it helped us. It helps us to get the job done that we actually want to do. So after we have the repository, what is then actually the next step that you would do in regular ASP.NET Core applications? I already can hear you. We go to Startup.cs and add the repository as a scoped service. However, as we learned in the previous video, we cannot add repositories or the DB context as scoped services in Blazor Server applications, because when we add scoped services, they are scoped to the entire circuit, so to the entire lifetime of the application. And this is of course not something that we want, and we explained this in depth in the previous video. Once again, you can find in the description of this video the link to the video that I mentioned here, and that video is about how to use Blazor Server and Entity Framework Core the right way. So in this case, we don't add the repository in Startup.cs. Then the question is, okay, but how do we proceed? So we can navigate directly to our update weather forecast component. And here we just want to replace the context, for instance, with our repository. So in this onInitialize the async lifecycle method, we actually use this DB context to get the weather forecast that we want to display, of course, in the UI, so that the user can actually change something to that forecast. So what we'll do here is we'll say like that, var repo, let's call it repo to be shorter, and here we will just create a new weather forecast repository. And we need to pass in a DB context, but in order to pass in a DB context, we use the context factory. So context factory dot create DB context, and that should actually do it. Now, after we create this DB context, what we can do here is, of course, we don't have this forecast anymore, but this context, but we have here a repo, and here get forecast by ID. That was actually the right one. Sorry for that. So get weather forecast by ID, and we have in this component parameter the ID that we get from the navigation. So let's just provide it. And if you ask yourself, why did we need to implement the IDisposable interface? Well, it's exactly because we want to use the weather forecast repository in this using construct. If you don't implement IDisposable, you cannot do that. So this is why implementing IDisposable in repositories when you work with Blazor Server applications is totally important. And here we will get the forecast as we did earlier, but we use the repository instead of using directly the DB context. And if we go just one step below, here in this update method that gets called when we click the button that we want to actually update the weather forecast, then we have to do exactly the same thing. So we say var repo equals new weather forecast repository, and we use the context factory, that should be this one, and create DB context, and that should do it. Here, once again, we don't really need all this stuff. What we actually need here is await repo.update weather forecast, and we just want to pass the model that we have. Once again, this is an application only to demonstrate how we can use repositories with Blazor Server apps. We don't do any validation and things similar to that, but of course in real applications you would totally need to do that. In this case, we just want to update the forecast, and then we navigate back to this fetch data component. Now let's click here to run the application and to see actually, or to check if our functionality is still working. So just a second until the application gets built. It's on the other screen, but we can bring it right here. So if we go here to fetch data, then we will get from the database the existing weather forecast, and we see that we have this forecast here. So let's edit the forecast, and instead of 10 degrees, let's, I don't know, write 50. Of course 50 is a lot, but let's update that. So we update, and we got back here to this list, and we see that everything was updated correctly. So we have actually changed, and instead of using directly the DB context in our update forecast component, we have used a repository that we have implemented right now. And there is a second bonus point that I just want to touch very, very briefly. And this is, how do we scope actually repositories or the DB context, because we could do exactly the same thing with the DB context, to the lifetime of the entire component. And the reason why this might be important is that, of course, EF Core comes with a lot of different very important features, I would say, regarding entity tracking. And if we want to take advantage of these features and track all the changes that occur, I would say, during the entire lifetime of the component, well, in that case, what we could do is actually, well, we are almost already there. But there is a slight change that we want to do in order for this to happen. So what we can do here is, let's go back here, is that of course in this onInitialized async, we can leave everything exactly like it is, but the only thing that we would need is private weather forecast repository and let's call this repo. And here in this onInitialized async, we just say that repo equals, and then we create actually this DB context. Now, if we do it like that, then in the update method, we actually don't really need to do this anymore. And actually, if we think better, we don't also really need to use this repo in this using statement, because this would mean that after we finish this, the repo gets disposed. So what we can do instead here is the following. So let's just copy this out of this using statement for just a while, and let's do it like that. This one we want to also copy out, and then we can get rid of this using statement, and then we can do exactly this. So that would ensure us that we have throughout the entire lifetime of this component, this instance of repository that of course has in turn an instance of the DB context, and everything should be fine. However, there is one thing that we still need to do here, and this is also we will need to implement IDisposable in our component. Okay, and let's just go here to our weather forecast repository, and we can just copy this one because it's easier to do that. Never copy paste code. But what we can do here is, of course, we can implement at the end this IDisposable, and we can have here repo dispose. And this would in turn dispose the DB context from the repository, and that would be it. And of course, in that case, we also can take this out of this using construct, and of course, we can just say like that. And once again, what we achieved right now is actually that we create a new instance of the repository once this component gets initialized, and we share the same instance throughout the lifecycle of this component. And this means that we can in turn use the different tracking features that we have on the DB context. Of course, we would probably use them in the repository itself and not in the component directly, but still, if you set up your components like this, you can actually use the same instance of your repository throughout the entire lifetime of the component. And when the component actually is not needed anymore, this dispose gets called, and of course, your repository will get disposed. And let's just, before we finish and wrap things up, let's just run this application again to make sure that our application is still working. In the end, I don't want to show you things that are not working. So let's make sure that this is actually working. So we have this weather forecast, and let's change this back, I don't know, to 15. Seems at least for where I'm now. And we say that the change was done. And if we go back to counter, then everything is okay. And back, actually, when we navigate here back, we get a new instance of this repository. And things go like that. So everything seems to work fine. So just as a short wrap up, what we have done in this video, we have implemented the repository pattern in a Blazor Server app. And one thing or two things actually that are very, very important when you do that is, first of all, that in your repository, you actually need to implement IDisposable, because this is needed in order to dispose the DB context when we don't need it anymore. And then the second thing that is really, really important is that we can implement, for instance, our repository that is scoped actually to the entire lifecycle of a certain component, and we can take advantage of all the features, of all the tracking features that Entity Framework Core brings to us. So this being said, thank you very, very much for watching. Please hit the subscribe button if you didn't do this already. And if you think that this content might be useful for others, don't be shy and share it among your peers via email, via social media, whatever floats your boat, as we can say. It's important, however, that if you think that this might be useful, that other people might find out about it, and I would be very, very thankful if you do that. And this being said, once again, thank you very, very much for watching, and until the next time, I wish you the very best.